It started with the worst Thanksgiving that anyone in our family could remember. Granny Lorraine was dying, even if nobody wanted to admit it. And that meant we'd be spending the holiday at a rundown farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. My father joked that the drive would be worth it just to make sure that she was really dead. Even at 10 years old, I thought it was an ugly thing to say, but I also couldn't blame him. There was a reason why my mother and her siblings lived as far away from Granny Lorraine as they could get, and why most of them had never been back to that farmhouse since they had left. To call Granny Lorraine cruel would have been an understatement. Every word out of her mouth was either a criticism or an insult, and I couldn't imagine what it must have been like growing up with her 24/7. A miserable, sleet-like rain was falling as we pulled up the muddy gravel driveway. I recognized Uncle Alan's beat-up Crown Vic, Uncle Isaac's pickup, and Aunt Carol's shiny new SUV already parked beside the house. We were the last ones to arrive. My mom opened an umbrella over my head and steered me through the front door. It actually felt colder inside of Granny Lorraine's house than it had outside. Apart from the beeping of medical machines and Aunt Carol's smoker's cough, the house was silent. Then in the dining room at the end of the hallway, I saw her. And Granny Lorraine lay with her eyes closed, surrounded by beeping machines and the reek of cleaning fluid. Most of her hair had fallen out and she seemed to have shrunken somehow. The withered body beneath the sheets reminded me unsettlingly of one of my cousin's toy dolls. "Late again as usual," Granny Lorraine snapped. "I suppose you two roly-poly lunks had to stop for donuts on the way, didn't you? While you were at it, you should have got some food for the boy. With that weak chest and awful haircut. Looks like a toilet brush." Our appearance was one of Granny Lorraine's favorite topics to comment on. I suddenly felt a little less bad for her. "We're here because you're sick, Ma," my mother said. Granny Lorraine snatched her hand away. She had become so gaunt that it almost looked like a claw. "I know why you're here, you pack of vultures," Granny Lorraine screeched. "You're here for the inheritance." My Uncle Alan, who had been sitting in the shadows, took a look around and laughed. The house was so old and run down that it was barely standing, and it was government assistance, or us, that paid the bills. "Oh, chuckle all you want, Baldy," Granny Lorraine snorted. "You'll get what's owed to you." It had sounded almost like a threat. I wondered if Granny Lorraine was losing her mind. Her eyes darted around the room, following the movements of something that wasn't there. What must it feel like to have dementia? To see things that nobody else could see? The thought sent a shiver up my spine. "Now," Granny Lorraine rasped, "where's my favorite grandson?" I cringed. I had been dreading this moment since we had first arrived. My throat was dry as I approached the bony form beneath the sheets. Up close, it was like I could smell the decay on her breath. Her hand shot out with surprising force and pulled my face towards her. For an awful moment, I thought she was going to kiss me. "Oh, don't talk to him, don't acknowledge him at all. And remember, the worst thing he can do is drive you mad." I had no idea what Granny Lorraine was ranting about, but her long dirty fingernails were digging into the skin of my neck. I pulled away with a shout, and then all hell broke loose. Granny Lorraine's eyes rolled backwards until they looked like a pair of white marbles. She toppled over convulsing, while the machines hooked up to her all shrieked in unison. The state-appointed nurse came running up, but it was obvious that there was nothing that she could do. Granny Lorraine was gone. I lifted my hands up like a criminal being arrested and I backed slowly away. My aunts and uncles were all staring at me, although no one said so. I could see the accusation in their eyes, as though what had just happened was somehow my fault. Maybe after so many years of being bullied by Granny Lorraine, each of them felt like they should be the one to hear her final thoughts. "Well?" my Uncle Isaac finally demanded. "What did she say?" "I don't know." I shook my head. "She was rambling." I clutched my stomach and said that I felt sick. My mother guided me to one of the bedrooms upstairs. I could already hear shouting from down below. Granny Lorraine may not have had much of a legacy, but that didn't prevent the family from squabbling over what little remained. Sometimes the most vicious fights are over the pettiest prizes. My mother sighed as she tucked me and handed me a glass of water. And to think, they haven't even started planning the funeral yet. I rolled over and watched the icy rain splatter against the bedroom window. Why had I lied about Granny Lorraine's last words? I had only pretended to be nauseous earlier, but the more that I thought about the whole thing, the more that I began to feel genuinely sick to my stomach. Why did grandmother have to go and croak right after telling me something so weird? I didn't want to spend all afternoon laying in bed feeling sorry for myself, but I also didn't want to run into one of Uncle Alan chugging whiskey in his storage room, or be forced to gossip with Aunt Carol. Through the floorboards, I could hear hushed greetings and clomping footsteps in the hallway. Even more relatives were arriving, nephews, cousins, strangers who I had never met. I felt exhausted just thinking about it. I was about to climb out of bed and search for something to read when the hairs on the back of my neck all stood up at once. Until that moment, I had always thought that goosebumps were just something from storybooks. A person couldn't actually feel that they were being watched. Could they? I turned over again, this time toward the wall. The dark shape in the corner could have been an antique coat rack or a shadow cast by the bookshelf. But it wasn't. The hardwood floor creaked beneath the man's boots. When he reached up to remove his old-fashioned stovepipe hat, his knuckles scraped against the ceiling. He twirled it between his long fingers as he approached. His breaths came in quick, excited little wheezes, like he was glad to see me. My mom had always complained about how the 10-foot-high ceilings in Granny Lorraine's house were never able to keep any of the warmth, which meant that the man in front of me was at least 8 feet tall. His long, baggy coat was so covered in grime that it was impossible to tell its original color. It may have been black. Was he some distant acquaintance of Granny Lorraine's, come by to pay his respects? If so, what was he doing in the upstairs room? I was about to ask when I remembered Granny Lorraine's words. Don't talk to him, don't acknowledge him at all, and remember, the worst thing he can do is drive you mad. The stranger tiptoed closer. His spine bent grotesquely as he bent over the bed, observing me with wide, hungry eyes. I realized with horror that the man's neck was extending somehow, stretching toward me like some kind of awful python. His fingers drummed even faster on the brim of his hat. When our faces were almost touching, he opened his mouth and licked his wormy purple lips. I had never seen anyone with such jagged teeth, there's so many of them. I pulled the covers up over my head and shut my eyes tight. The sound of the tall man's teeth gnashing above me was so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. The worst thing that he can do is drive you mad. I repeated the phrase over and over in my head, but I couldn't quite believe it. Until suddenly, the noise stopped. Apart from the patter of the rain and the grumblings of the adults downstairs, the bedroom was silent. Even so, I didn't dare to peek out from beneath the covers. Maybe that was exactly what the tall man wanted. Maybe that was what he was waiting for. I lay still like I was playing dead, and I counted the ticks of the old-fashioned grandfather clock in the hallway, and then a hand wrapped around my shoulder. "Oh, buddy," my father sighed. "You must be feeling awful. You want to talk about it?" I lowered the sheets. Apart from my father and me, the room was empty. I did want to talk about what had just happened, very badly in fact, but that was exactly what Granny Lorraine had warned me not to do. For all I knew, the tall man was out in the hallway, waiting for me to mention him, and what would he do then? I thought of those long fingers with too many joints, and all of those shark-like teeth crammed into a human mouth, and I shuddered. My father told me that dinner was ready and offered to bring up a tray to me, but I shook my head. The last thing that I wanted was to lay around by myself waiting for the tall man to show up again. I got to my feet shakily and followed my father downstairs. On the way, I looked for the tall man's face in the yellowed family photographs that lined the walls, but I found nothing. The house was packed. Cousins who I had never met before clapped me on the back, offering their condolences. Uncle Isaac and Aunt Carol were bickering about what to do with Granny Lorraine's body as they pulled trays of food out of the oven. Uncle Alan just sat in the corner and threw back slugs of whiskey from the bottle. As uncomfortable as the whole thing was, I was grateful for the noise and distraction that so many relatives provided. It helped me to avoid thinking about the tall man for a little while at least. I ran into Uncle Alan outside the bathroom after dinner. From the cold sweat on his forehead and the sour smell in his breath, I figured he had been puking his guts out. He smiled boozily and held open the door. "I know this sucks, kid, but it'll all be over soon, trust me." Something moved in the dark hallway behind Uncle Alan. I bit down a scream as the grinning visage of the tall man appeared out of the shadows above him. "What is it, kid? What's wrong?" Uncle Alan turned unsteadily. "Oh shit." The tall man's face contorted with fury. He clamped a hand over Uncle Alan's face, smothering his shout with the other. He opened the lapel of his filthy overcoat. There was only blackness on the other side. Uncle Alan barely had time to kick his legs and flail his arms before he was flung into the void. The tall man closed his coat, and then cocked his head to the side as though daring me to speak. I forced myself to look toward the warm golden glow of the kitchen, where the adults were still laughing, arguing, and scraping forks against plates, completely unaware of what was in the house with us. As I began to walk toward them, I could feel the tall man looming over me, matching me step for step. If my mother or father saw him, would they meet the same fate as Uncle Alan? Back in the kitchen, the cousins were getting ready to leave, and my mother and her siblings were working out the sleeping arrangements. I begged my parents to let me sleep on a fold-out cot in the room, and they reluctantly agreed. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to protect them or whether I wanted them to protect me, but I hoped that there would be safety in numbers. Aunt Carol and Uncle Isaac would each sleep in their childhood rooms, understandably. Nobody wanted to take Granny Lorraine's. No one mentioned Uncle Alan. The cousins shuffled out into the night, most of them still stuttering about what a bunch of ungrateful city slickers we all were. I held out hope that I would see the tall man leaving with them, but there was no such luck. Unless I had just imagined him, he was still in the house with us. I stuck close to my parents that night. I wouldn't even go to brush my teeth alone. I caught my father whispering something about trauma or age regression. They probably figured that my strange behavior was a result of witnessing Granny Lorraine's death, and if so, that was fine with me. I lay awake in my lumpy cot long after both of them had fallen asleep. My mind buzzed with questions. Who was the tall man? What did he want? How would Granny Lorraine known about him in the first place? The branches scraping against the window pane sounded like his fingers, and whenever a draft made the door squeak on its hinges, I felt sure that he had come for us at last. When my eyes snapped open, it felt like I had only been asleep for a few minutes, but somehow I was certain that I had been asleep for much longer than that. My throat was parched, but I didn't dare to go for a glass of water. A light flickered on in the hallway. Someone coughed. Of course, Aunt Carol. When she couldn't sleep, she would smoke. I watched her shadow pass by the door. Seconds later, another followed after. Against my better judgment, I crept out of bed and peeked into the hallway. Aunt Carol was fumbling with the doorknob of her room. The tall man stood beside her, close enough to touch, like he was waiting for her to notice him. Should I warn her, or back away and hope that nothing happened? Before I could decide what to do, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet. Aunt Carol looked my way. "Aunt Carol," I murmured as loudly as I dared. "Could you come here for a minute, please?" My aunt approached with a frown. The tall man crawled along the ceiling above her, his head twisted around backwards. I was amazed that she hadn't felt his breath on the back of her neck. I had to keep Aunt Carol distracted for just a few more minutes. I had a bad dream," I stammered. "Will you come with me to get a glass of water?" "Okay, fine." Aunt Carol rolled her eyes. The tall man did too, in a sick imitation of her expression. A few drops of saliva dribbled onto the floor between us. Before I could say anything else, Aunt Carol looked up, and she yelled. As she shrieked and pointed, the tall man opened his coat and dropped down, enveloping her within it. He rose to his feet and advanced on me, both sides of his coat held high like the wings of some enormous bat. From the abyss within, I thought that I could still hear Aunt Carol's distant and slowly fading scream. In just a few seconds, I too would be swept inside. The worst thing that he can do is drive you mad. The worst thing he can do is drive you mad. I'm going to get a glass of water, I said through gritted teeth and then turned toward the bathroom. Cloth rustled as the tall man's coat passed over me. Like a shadow or a bad dream, he was gone. That simple act, filling a glass, drinking it, and going back to bed, was the hardest thing that I had ever done. I shut the door tight behind me, pulled the covers up over my head, and I began to pray. Please, please God, let him be gone when I wake up. The Thanksgiving morning dawned bright and clear. I stretched and sighed, content in my cozy cot. At least until I remembered where I was and what was happening. Granny Lorraine's death, the tall man, Aunt Carol, and Uncle Alan's gruesome disappearances. As it all came rushing back, I realized that my head wasn't the only one on the pillow. The tall man stared back at me, his mouth stretched into a wide smile. I gritted my teeth, rolled over, and got out of bed. My parents and Uncle Isaac were already downstairs in the kitchen, making coffee, chatting, and pouring Granny Lorraine's off-brand cereal into plastic bowls. It was strange. Aunt Carol and Uncle Alan were both missing, but nobody had asked about them. On my way down the stairs, I took down an old family photograph. I pulled my mother aside and showed it to her. Who's this? I asked, pointing to a much younger and happier Uncle Alan. Who's who? My mom squinted, confused. Honey, there's nobody there. This is just me, your Uncle Isaac, and your Granny Lorraine. I wasn't sure which possibility terrified me more. The idea that she couldn't see Uncle Alan and Aunt Carol, or the idea that she was pretending not to see them. Did my parents know about the tall man too? Or did being taken by the tall man somehow erase people from existence? Either way, nobody included either Uncle Alan or Aunt Carol in the funeral arrangements. My father explained that we would be burying Granny Lorraine that morning, and then driving home in the afternoon. Don't worry, he winked. After today, you'll never have to set foot in this miserable place again. Once we had finished breakfast, I was ordered upstairs to shower and change clothes. I hated to make myself so vulnerable with the tall man around, but I had a plan. I left the lights on and the doors open. I checked behind the shower curtain and even sang hymns while I washed off. I had no way of knowing whether the noise and light would keep the tall man away, but I had to try something. So far, he had only been able to appear when I was alone or with one other person, but for all I knew, each person that he took made him that much stronger. I dried off and went to the closet for my stuffy, kid-sized suit, and that was how the tall man got me. When I stepped inside, he swung down from the ceiling, twisting hideously so that we were face to face. I began to scream, but then salvaged it with an old hymn. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. The tall man's face darkened as though I had disappointed him. It was a perfectly ordinary face, mid-40s, light-skinned, sad green eyes, and somehow that made it all the more horrible. The tall man scowled and backed away into the gloom of the closet. While the adults got ready, I searched for clues about the tall man. Granny Lorraine didn't have a family tree or any genealogy books. The only reading material in the entire house was a stack of romance novels and tabloid magazines beside a recliner. I did, however, find a cardboard box full of my mother's old school things. At the very bottom was a stack of crayon drawings that she had done in kindergarten. They looked like the usual stick figure family that any child might draw, except for the tall figure in a stovepipe hat who appeared in the corner of every page. My heart skipped a beat when we all finally walked out together into the soothing fall sunshine. Was this it? Were we about to leave the tall man behind for good? My mother turned a key in the front door lock and then rested her head on the worn siding. "Bye, Ma," she sighed, and then stood tall and walked down to our car and climbed into the driver's seat. Uncle Isaac, who got car sick on the winding country roads, rode shotgun, while my father and I piled into the back seat. The engine turned over, and a few minutes later, Granny Lorraine's house was just a gray speck among endless fields of brown grass. Uncle Isaac turned around to ask my father something, and then clamped his hand over his mouth. The tall man had appeared in the seat between us. His spine had bent gruesomely to fit into the tight space, and his multi-jointed fingers were inching eagerly toward me. The tall man couldn't hurt me unless I acknowledged him, but my father didn't know that. He let out a grunt of surprise and swung a fist at the tall man's face. Now that sucker punch would have knocked out any ordinary man, but it only connected with empty air. The tall man contorted in the back seat like some awful boneless animal, twisting until he had stuffed my father inside that filthy overcoat. Memories of front yard ball games and fishing trips flashed before my eyes, and just as quickly my father had been swallowed up. My mother kept her hands perfectly placed on the steering wheel, like she was taking a driver's test. "So, honey," she forced herself to say, "what would you like for lunch after the funeral?" I don't know how I responded or how we managed to have a normal conversation, but by the time that we had reached the funeral home, the tall man had vanished once again. My tear-filled eyes locked with my mother's in the rearview mirror. It was the closest we ever came to talking about the secret that we shared. A few weeks after we buried Granny Lorraine, I got a letter in the mail from Uncle Isaac. There had been no sign of the tall man since he had taken my father, although whether that was because his hunger was sated or because he was biding his time, I had no idea. I still sensed him sometimes, waiting beneath a tree in the rain or in the grimy public bathroom stall beside mine, for example, but he hadn't actually appeared. Maybe that was what made me reluctant to open Uncle Isaac's letter, the fear that if I did, this whole thing would start all over again. To get my mind off of everything that happened, my mother had pressured me to take part in the school play. I reluctantly agreed, and while I soon discovered that I enjoyed acting and prop making, I didn't like the feeling of being at school after hours. All those empty corridors, those long lines of silent lockers and darkened classrooms, seemed like a perfect environment for the tall man. One gray Tuesday before winter break, my friends Chelsea and Aaron announced that they were going to stay late to paint the background scenery. We were putting on our play that Friday and time was running out. The last thing that I wanted was to spend even more time in that creepy after-hours auditorium. But the prospect of waiting around by myself for my mother to pick me up was even worse. I did my best to have fun with my friends, but the truth was, I was just waiting for something to happen. And so it did. Miss Healy, the play director, suddenly began looking a little green. She stood in a hurry and announced that she was going to the restroom, and that we had better behave until she got back. Chelsea, Aaron, and I managed to keep straight faces until she was out the door, and then we burst out laughing and started flicking paint at each other with our brushes. I didn't notice the gaunt figure moving behind the stage curtains until it was right in front of me. The moment that I saw the tall man, I knew that I wasn't going to let him take anyone else, no matter what it took. I grabbed the jar of paint and splashed it into Chelsea's eyes. Aaron's jaw dropped, but he had no time to react before I got to him as well. By the time that Miss Healy got back, both of them were crying and rolling on the floor, and the tall man had faded back behind the curtains with a scowl. Of course, I was removed from the play and suspended. There was talk of psychiatrists or even lawsuits, but it came to nothing in the end. My mother went through the motions of punishing me, but I think she understood better than anyone why I might have done what I did. And all the time at home finally gave me a chance to read Uncle Isaac's letter. "And by the time you read this," it began, "I'll be someplace where he can't find me. Or at least I hope so. I can't do this anymore. I can't go on waiting for him to make me jump or gasp at the wrong moment. I can't go on pretending that the people around me aren't being crammed inside of that horrible black coat. I wish I had some answers for you, kid. I can't tell you what he is or where he came from. All I know is, once you start seeing him, you can't stop. He's everywhere. And here's another thing, something that I think about a lot late at night while I'm trying to drink myself to sleep. What if our family aren't the only ones? What if sooner or later one of those awful things appears to everybody? What if just about everyone you meet is sharing that same horrible secret, but as soon as anyone tries to acknowledge it, a tall man takes them away? At first, I thought that he would come for me as soon as I started writing this. I thought that somehow he would understand that I was breaking the rules. But you know something? He's hovering over my shoulder right now. He can see the words on the page and the pistol that I've got pressed against my chin. And from the rumbling noise in his chest and the drool running down his chin, he's laughing. Weeks passed before the police found Uncle Isaac's body. The worst he can do is drive you mad, Granny Lorraine had said. At first, her words had felt comforting, but now they seemed like a curse. I would never be able to let my guard down. The tall man would always be there around a corner behind a curtain, or crawling across the ceiling of a dark room. He would always be trying to break my resolve and take the ones that I loved. Even back then, I thought that I could understand why Uncle Isaac had done what he did. A few days later, however, something happened that made me swear never to follow in my uncle's footsteps. It was around 9 o'clock a few days before Christmas. My mother was in the shower and I was sitting on the living room floor playing video games. I had found that the bright colors and repetitive motions helped to numb the pain that I'd been feeling since the tall man had come into my life. I had just paused to take a drink of water when the doorbell rang. Ordinarily, the tall man never announced himself, but something about that long, lonely chime gave me a sinking feeling. I mean, who else could be on our porch so late at night? The shower was still running and I knew that I would be in serious trouble if I didn't answer it. And so I dragged my feet to the front door. I peeked through the side window, but all I could see was the wet and black asphalt of the street and snowdrifts lit by Christmas lights. If it was the tall man, the last thing that I wanted to do was accidentally acknowledge him by asking, "Who is it?" I gulped and opened the door. The package delivery man outside looked chilled to the bone. He rubbed his hands together, blew on them, and then passed me a package with a pen. Sign for this. It was addressed to my mother, and I realized with a twinge of guilt that she had probably ordered me a last-minute Christmas present. I scribbled on the pad the delivery driver handed me and waved goodbye to him. He was slogging his way back through the snow to his truck when I noticed a pair of black boots standing beside me on the frozen doormat. The tall man. He seemed to be watching the house across the street. At first, I couldn't see what was so special about it. It was just an ordinary suburban house, with an ordinary suburban family gathered around the television in its living room. I could see them through the window, sipping mugs of hot chocolate while they watched some feel-good holiday movie. A father, 2 twin boys, a baby girl, and... No, it couldn't be. Another tall man rested his hands on the back of the baby's bouncy chair while she leaned toward the screen oblivious. His boots, a top hat, and black overcoat were identical to those of the tall man beside me. But his face was Uncle Isaac's. Although there was no way of knowing across such a long distance, I felt sure that he had seen me. I bit my cheeks to mask the horror on my face and then backed through the front doorways, though I had done nothing more than collect a package. The tall man pressed his face against the window. He held a 5-jointed finger up to his lips and grinned. I turned away. When I glanced over my shoulder again, both of the tall men were gone. It didn't matter though. I knew that they would be back. It's possible that I'm not the first one to try to tell the world about the tall man. For all I know, all the letters people have written over the years all wound up stuffed into the void inside those long dark codes, and all the forum posts mysteriously disappeared into the black hole of cyberspace. For those who don't know, the truth sounds insane. For those who do, it's too dangerous to repeat. Maybe you have no idea what I'm talking about, but even if you've never seen a tall man, don't worry. Someday you will.